Council work session for November 15, 2022. First item on our work session agenda is land use code update housing, and we'll hear from staff.
Good evening, Mayor and council members. As you know, one of the major items constituted a chapter and a series of work scope items that came out of the master plan was housing. In particular, the vision for housing at all market price points to be available in Evans, from attainable housing for first-time homebuyers through what we refer to as the missing middle and other home buying opportunities throughout the stages of life. So over the last several months, there's been a housing task force that's been established to start looking at this. I'll turn this over to Ann Bess Johnson, our Community Development Director, who will introduce the consultant that's been heading the effort, and it's included a number of realtors and other community members in presenting the findings to date that they have for you on this very significant effort.
All right, thank you, Mr. Reedy. And Graham Smith is attending via Zoom, and he's going to give a presentation. He is our lead consultant and project manager for Multi-Studio that is working with us on updating the entire land use code. And we are talking with specifically on housing this evening. And on Friday, there's going to also be a tour of housing types. So we'll actually get to look at what some of these things that are being presented on paper look like in person on Friday. So Graham, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Ann. I appreciate the introduction, and good evening, everyone. My name is Graham Smith with Multi-Studio, and as it has been previously mentioned, we've been leading the code update effort for the last several months, and we're at a fairly exciting point in the project right now because we're starting to pivot from understanding your current code and regulations and looking at some best practices and turning to actually starting to outline and draft the code. I'm going to share my screen if I can. I can't share my screen. It says it's been disabled. So that'll work. Let me try and get out of mine real quick. If you want to go to the next slide. What we thought we'd do, because we're at a kind of a key point here, what we thought we'd do with you all tonight is kind of walk through a little bit of project progress, just really quickly, but then we wanted to focus on the housing discussions that we've been having, some of the things that we're starting to look at in terms of putting the housing sections together for the code, and then talk about some next steps. So go ahead and go to the next. So this is our project timeline, our project approach. You can see we're here towards the end of task 3, which we call discussions. We've had, as I said, we put together some case studies and best practices. We had a community meeting on October 11th, an open house for people to drop by and talk with us code. And then we're trying to finish up the regulatory framework this week and get it over to Ann and her group for that initial review. And then we've started drafting some of the initial pieces, and it's very early on, but we're starting to put that together. And then sometime later into the spring of 2023, we'll be coming back to you all formally for adoption of the land use code. Go ahead and go to the next screen. So as I mentioned, a little bit of update on our status of the project. We had an October 11th community meeting. It was a community meeting, but it was also kind of a festival. We had food trucks, we had door prizes, we had games that people could play before the windy, cold weather moved in that evening. But so it was kind of inside and outside. But we wanted to engage the community in discussions around the 4 primary topics that we found in our diagnosis of the land use code, and where our case studies and best practices were focusing. And those topics included housing, which we'll get into a little bit more tonight, neighborhood character, and the design of neighborhoods and what those look like in the future in Evans, and what can be addressed through the land use code. Development itself, development both of residential in terms of neighborhoods and different housing types, but also commercial development, and where are those commercial destinations, goods and services and jobs going to reside in the future, and how are they put together in Evans? And then finally, streets, and how do our streets start to frame the development patterns, the development uses and types that we want to see in our community. And those are things, all of these things are things that we can put in the code to make sure that the master plan, Explore Evans, is implemented in the way the community had defined. So go to the next slide, please. The other piece that we're just getting started with, we had our first meeting last week, is we're similar to housing, which we'll talk about in a minute. We're wanting to dive deeper into the US 85 corridor and the redevelopment and development of that corridor. And so we've assembled what we're calling the District Redevelopment Advisory Committee. As I said, we just kicked off that group last week, really starting to talk about what the current issues in the corridor are. Are there any opportunities that we can build from? And some of the things that have happened in the past with the overlay district that's currently implemented or currently enforced in the corridor currently. The committee is made up of property and business owners, planning commission members, city council members. I know a couple of you in the room are on that committee and attended that meeting. But it's really, the intent of this group is really from a variety of perspectives, dig into the overlay district, how it's being used now to result in development in terms of use, development scale and pattern and design, and the design standards that go along with that. To see what can be done with the land use code update to, I'll say, more readily enable development to happen in the corridor that is contextual to the corridor itself, being a highway corridor, but being really close to some of your neighborhoods and some of your industrial areas, and how all of those pieces relate together, so that we can start to identify what is the appropriate development in terms of use, scale, pattern, and form, and then get that into the zoning code, the land use code, so that those things can happen, hopefully fairly easy. So I think part of the discussion is an overlay district necessary going forward, or can we get some of these things directly in the code? And so we'll be walking through all of these topics as we go forward over the next 4 to 5 months with that committee. Similar to the tour that Ann mentioned on Friday, in January, this group will be taking a tour to look at another corridor within the region that has yet to be identified, that might be a good example of how 85 could develop in the future. Next slide, please. So that's kind of an update of what we've been working on most recently. So to dive into the housing topic, I think most of you probably know that the land use code update was significantly funded by an IHOP grant from the state. The intention of the IHOP grant specifically is to focus on the ability to provide more affordable housing. And so we've kept that in mind with almost everything we've done, all the discussions we've had around the housing topic, and building from the Explore Evans master plan to make sure that we're, again, hitting the community's marks in terms of what they want to see in the future. As we mentioned a minute ago, we did put together a technical advisory committee for the housing discussions, spoke with the developers, economic development folks, realtors, and really tried to dive into some of the issues that were affecting housing and the provision of housing in Evans. And so we'll go through some of those things tonight in terms of challenges and opportunities. And then as Ann already mentioned, there's a tour on Friday that I think some of you will be attending. If you can go to the next slide. So in terms of challenges, again, this is really coming from some of our initial research, but also from our discussions with the focus group or the advisory group. And so what we've identified is the biggest challenges is the supply and demand, or the supply and the need mismatch There's a significant amount of supply of single family, of a suburban, I'll say of a suburban pattern. But there's a broader need, which we'll touch on in a minute, a variety of housing types in the community, which ties into the second point, which is that lack of variety. With that greater supply of a single type of housing, it lacks a focus on workforce housing. As you all are very aware, the housing market in the Front Range and in the Denver metropolitan area is one of the most expensive in the country. And so with a single family product, a lot of times that cuts out workforce housing. There are some other examples in the community, but not in a significant enough way that it really addresses the workforce housing need. And so with that lack of variety, there's an estimate that more than half the population is being priced out of Evans because of that lack of variety. The other challenge that we talked about during the committee meetings was the standards, as we'll talk about in a minute, lack a lot of nuance, a lot of differing details as they're applied, as the different districts are defined. And the one consistent across them, other than the standards, is the fact that the land that's required for development is significant. And as you'll see, there's not really a variety of lot sizes, lot types in your standard residential zoning districts. And so what it does is it results in larger projects consuming more land. And if you look at the last bullet point here, with rents and sales prices rising because of the demand in the overall region, the cost of land is one of those significant things that contributes to that, as well as water and building materials that we've seen rise over the last couple of years. The other big challenge is with the lack of variety in your standards, particularly the lack of different standards. You all are seeing a lot of use of a planned unit development process. And what we've also discovered in your planned unit development process is the standards for that are generally poorly defined, and the expectations, I should say, are poorly defined for developers that are using that process. And really the community benefit that should come about with the use of a PUD process is not well defined or received by the city in a lot of cases. So those are kind of the big challenges that we talked through. If you want to go to the next slide, we can talk about your current zoning standards, as I mentioned. I've got highlighted here in red, in the red box, kind of your typical, your most used, I'll say your most standard residential zoning districts of R1, R2, R3, and then your residential commercial / residential. Those four, if you look at those categories, you look at all of the standards as you move down the page in that red box, 99% of those are identical, from minimum front setback to side street, rear setback, lot coverage, minimum open space and zone district area, and then height as well. And so where there are some nuances, they're not substantial enough to really result in a different pattern or a different type of development. And so with that similarity, we see a lack of variety of housing types. And as we pointed out here, and as I mentioned a minute ago, a higher reliance on the planned unit development process to just do things a little bit differently that again aren't resulting in a significant change in the housing types. So that's one of the things that we really want to focus on with the update is how do we start to build in some of those nuances between the districts that encourage not only different types of housing, but potentially a different mix of housing types within a single category. So if you go to the next slide.
Hey, Graham, sorry to
Yep.
interrupt you. I have a question for you.
Sure, go ahead.
Back a couple slides when you talk about lack of housing variety, lack of workforce housing, and greater than half the population priced out of Evans. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think that we have actually a lot of workforce housing. Most of the homes that I see in Evans are usually those, I don't want, for lack of a better word, starter homes. You know, they're usually, or priced less than the majority of Weld County, or priced less than Greeley, in the area. So our housing is actually, I think, more affordable than our surrounding communities in Will County. So I kind of wanted to know, what do you mean by lack of workforce housing? For me, I think we're lacking more of those estate-type houses, because we have townhomes being built, we have Besler homes being built, we have Peakview. I mean, we have a number of affordable housing in Evans, so I kind of want to know what you mean by that.
Yeah, so for clarification, you have I'll say a mix of older housing and what we would consider older, as you described, starter housing. A starter housing at a price point that's a little bit of an older product. You've also got newer single family, obviously, as you guys have been growing. And a lot of that is at a market rate that is above what would be considered a workforce. You are starting to see some variety. You're starting to see some bigger development projects, or I say starting. You're seeing some bigger development projects in terms of apartments, and as you said, some what we would consider missing middle townhomes. But in large part, what you're seeing is single family residential that is becoming the overwhelming, I'll say, type of housing in the community. So the workforce housing target is not being met at the same rate as what the growth of the single family more. And I would agree with you in terms of the housing in Evans is more affordable. I wouldn't say it's affordable, right? And working towards affordability and workforce housing, it's a very difficult proposition in your market. But that's really what that's talking about, is the lack of a workforce housing to keep up with the pace, one, of the growth and the need for that in your community. Does that help?
Well, I guess I'm still a little confused on that. By definition, workforce housing, what type of price range then are you considering workforce housing? Because from my perspective, I mean, the average home price in Evans is about $378,000, which is comparably less than Greeley and the other properties in Will County, and it's significantly less than the Front Range community. So in my opinion, that's more affordable to the workforce than it was if they lived outside of Evans. So I guess, what price range are we talking about for workforce housing are we describing, or are we looking at?
So workforce housing is typically defined between 80 and 100, excuse me, 80 and 120% of the area median income. And I think part of the flip side of what you're arguing there, or what you're describing there, is the area median income for Evans is lower. So the price point for workforce housing in Evans is going to be lower. And again, while it is more affordable, it doesn't hit that definition of workforce housing.
Can I add on to that, because that actually goes with the question I had. So when you're looking at that and affordability, are you specific to homes or home ownership, or are you considering price points of apartments or multi-unit structures?
Yeah, it's purchasing, and it's sales and rents. So it is the consideration of the rents as well.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword, that if your area median income is low, like ours is, and I think part of that is, to Mayor Clark's point, because we have, in most of our opinions, pretty affordable housing, you tend to see that lower median income, but then that almost constitutes a greater need for lower price point housing.
Right.
It's kind of an odd cycle here.
Yeah, in some cases, and I think one of the things we'll talk about here in a little bit is enabling, and we actually heard from the developers that they'd be interested in taking some of this on, but enabling a greater variety, I'll say more easily. So enabling a greater variety of housing types to be built. And that can be all across the spectrum, from ADUs, accessory dwelling units, to townhomes, to apartments, to larger scale apartments, enabling those things to happen a little bit easier, and on, I'll say less land would be appealing, and can start to drive some of the price points down.
And part of me, though, wonders, kind of thinking about this, sorry. So if I consider my husband and I, we've always wanted to move. our options to move outside or within Evans are non-existent, I'll say. There is one neighborhood that has larger homes that we could potentially move to if we wanted a larger property. But really, other than that, our only option for a home above that kind of $500,000 price point is moving outside of Evans. And even $500,000 at this point is, I think for most now, kind of that starter. We're ratcheting back down. But even then, there's one neighborhood. So part of me then goes, well, what if we looked at incorporating some more kind of estate style homes that could bring in those individuals that do have a higher income that would offset that, kind of balance that more? Because to me, that is part of our problem with the affordable housing is we don't necessarily have that balance because we don't have those larger homes to help bring in that higher level of income into that piece.
The move
Right.
up home, the move up that allows then another home to
Yes.
be occupied by somebody that's going to be their move up,
Yeah,
which then it's a domino effect.
exactly. Because like I said, if we move, there's really Neville's Crossing, and then there's very limited kind of larger homes for us to move to. So we either have a lateral move or we move elsewhere. And I do see that as a pretty substantial problem. So,
Right. And I think we'll get into this in a minute, but it's really about, we often talk about it in terms of creating for the city, creating an entire housing portfolio. So you can't just, the reason you're having some of the challenges now is because there's one type, and this is an oversimplification, but there's largely one type of housing product being built. There are a few other things being done. But the more we can diversify the housing types on the high end and on the middle and the low end, I think that there's a lot of benefits that can come from all of it.
The other thing I would like to just bring one more thing up because it hit me while we were all talking is the number of people in the home. So that's another reason I have a problem with this half the population being priced out. For example, I have 6 people in one apartment right now, all adults, and they're making it fine. They in fact could probably split up and get their own, but because they're all saving money, which I understand, that's how they're living. So I don't know about the affordability. And then less land, good night, I'm already on top of my neighbors. But the accessory dwelling units, I already see campers all around town and other places where people are already living in their parents' driveway or their friend's driveway or tucked behind the house. So I would just like to put those reminders out there because I think that's why we're all having such a hard time grasping this, is that, yes, that may be how it's seen, but there are other aspects to that.
Right. And I think that again, that's where we go to the variety of types, because there's people that across the spectrum, from the high end to the low end, there's going to be people that can afford somewhere in that range. And if we want to get to a variety and to allow people to have more affordability, more workforce, more affordable housing, then we need to focus on a variety and a complete portfolio again, so that all those ranges are met.
So I have a question. Hi, my name is Allie. I'm on Zoom. Are you able to hear me?
yes.
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. So you mentioned that in Evans we have 80 to 120 AMI. So when I work kind of within that scope of clientele that have that type of AMI, and I can tell you that a lot of people are struggling to pay rent. And these are people that are renting currently. When I think about that AMI, I think of not your typical housing. More or less, we would look at low income housing in order to assist that specific AMI that you're mentioning. And so in order to diversify housing, we would definitely need to consider that, because people within that specific parameter are not able to pay the rents that are right now being, in essence, marketed for current apartments. And so I know you mentioned to, kind of downsize the land and the square footage and whatnot, but if I think of that in the form of a home, I don't see it being feasible. I mean, potentially more of like a townhome, as well as utilizing mixed use, apartments and retail kind of thing, but in the low income sector, if I make any sense, especially when we're speaking of 80 to 120 AMI.
Yeah, was that a question, or because I agree with you.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is, what are you I mean, I know you said you're saying accessory dwellings. So like, I mean, how would you configure something that would fall within that parameter? Because as is right now, as a whole, in this entire state of Colorado, 80 to 120 AMI, they're having a difficult time paying rent.
Yeah. And I think it's a great lead in. If you go to the next slide, I think we started, keep going to the next one. So in answer to your question, I'll get to this slide in a second, but in answer to your question, that is the hardest part about affordable housing. And really, let me back up. That's the most difficult part about trying to provide more affordable housing. To get to a HUD definition of affordable housing, that's 30% of AMI. And that's almost impossible without a significant amount of subsidy. And so what we're trying to look at, and really, in many ways, the best you can do in a land use code is that variety of housing types to occur, whether it comes from apartments to small scale infill and redevelopment, or small scale new development, like smaller units on smaller lots, duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, and some of those other products that aren't necessarily the cost and the cost burden of a single family house, because a lot of people just can't afford that, and particularly in your market, that becomes more and more difficult. What we tried to identify with some of the opportunities that you guys have is study. There is a variety of demand in your community. In the ownership, there's really, the demand in the community is really split about 70% ownership, 30% rental, which makes sense for your community as being more of a, kind of almost a standalone community, but being immediately adjacent to Greeley. A lot of folks want to get to that ownership position, but the affordability is keeping a lot of people from that, not only in your situation, but across the country. But of that 70-30 split in the ownership, there's really opportunities in houses in what we call cottages, or smaller houses and townhomes, with a little bit in duplex and some other things. But really the variety of demand really comes in the rental. As you can see from this chart on the right. And again, these aren't exact numbers. These are supposed to be kind of order of magnitude or directional numbers in terms of demand. But you can see even in the renters, having walk-ups or lofts, multiple units like tri and quadplexes, duplexes, townhomes, and then renters that are looking for individual units like houses, cottages, or even accessory dwelling units. And so trying to create that overall, as I called it a portfolio a minute ago, but really that development ecosystem that allows developers, builders, individuals to come in and build those different types to meet the market demand in your community is really what we're trying to enable through the zoning code, so that you can hit a variety of price points, and you can hit the variety of ownership that people want, either owner or renter. And as we put here, in some of our discussions with the developers, they're interested in seeing the opportunities to build different products, and build them in a way that's one, meaningful to them, but it's also meaningful to the community. And I think the developers we talked to were really interested in working with the community to figure out how to go about building those things. If you go to the next slide, So real quickly, I've got about 15 minutes left here. So on the public comment side, through the October 11th meeting, specifically with regard to housing, people were most concerned about the quality of design and the design of the neighborhood and neighborhood character, the variety of housing they were interested in, but they wanted it to be strategic. So somebody mentioned a minute ago of, not being on top of your neighbor and not being, not necessarily having a lot of smaller lots, but being more strategic in the locations and the context in which this variety could occur. So where are apartments appropriate? Where is larger scale development versus neighborhood scale development appropriate, and those types of things. So addressing the size of the development, addressing the size of the units themselves, and then always is an issue with development of any type of development, particularly housing, is parking. So how do we address the parking if we're going to allow these variety of units? And then affordability was also a desire. How do we encourage flexible design opportunities that don't require a lot of expense into the design of housing units, so that we can start to pass those along to consumers at a more affordable rate? And then making sure that all housing and neighborhoods are connected to goods and services and to other points in the community, and then tying into the neighborhood characters, what are those neighborhood amenities that need to be present for residents in the community? So those were the comments that we got to talk to the public about housing. If you go to the next slide, we can start talking more about kind of our approach to this, to the housing issue, and what we wanted to get feedback, which we've already started providing me. So thank you very much for that. But I wanted to give you a kind of a glimpse into our approach, which is really starting to look at, instead of units per acre or the appropriate number of units on a piece of property, we really start to try and look at this at more of what we call a typology-based approach. So defining the types of defining the types of housing that are appropriate for Evans, going current and going forward. And as you can see from this wheel of housing types, there's quite a few of them that we would segment out and start to define, are these appropriate for Evans? And if so, what are the development standards that go with these? This allows us to do a few things. One, as I mentioned early on, your current code doesn't have a difference in really the development standards in your core residential districts. When you start looking at the typologies, you can really start to define the nuances between different types and different development standards. All of this is done with the goal of trying to achieve some compatibility of a variety of types. So where you wouldn't look at the whole wheel here and say all of these types, because of their scale and pattern and form, would all go together, but you might pick out 3 or 4 of these different types that are adjacent to one another in the wheel and say, you know what, you could actually allow these in a neighborhood, or allow some of these to be infill projects in a neighborhood in an area that similar scale, similar pattern, and similar development standards already exist. And so we really start to look at things and putting pieces together in terms of infill and redevelopment, but also new development, of how we can provide that variety, really start to focus on what is the scale of development, and not necessarily whether it's one unit or one unit with an ADU or a duplex or a triplex, but what are the things that are compatible to go together and can create a neighborhood? And then finally, focusing on the neighborhood design in terms of streets and streetscapes, parks and open space, and other things that all influence the housing and the development of neighborhoods. So that's kind of our overall approach. If you go to the next slide, the way we start to put this together is in a table like this. And so I've numbered these 1, 2, and 3. So the first step is really to define the building types and the lot types, and then define the development standards that are appropriate with each one of those different types. So when we look at that, again, we can start to look at development standards in terms of lot standards, setbacks, building heights, that start to group compatible or like scaled housing types together. And then finally, number 3 is you look at the individual zoning districts, and you can start to tier things as you look down the left side of this table. You can start to see where you go from the R1E, which is kind of your estate residential, where those detached larger lots, that type of development can happen all the way down to the RC, the RC, where you start to get more intense housing types to occur. And so you can start to mix and match things within the appropriate context under the appropriate category. If you go to the next slide, this is how we started to, we've just started kind of putting these puzzle pieces together in terms of the housing. And what we've identified is these pieces in red are some of the things that might be missing from your current code or are missing from your current standards to allow some of that variety, also some more affordable housing types to occur. So you'll see on here what we call a detached house, which would be a single family unit, but on a small lot. So when we move over to the lot standards, we would look at, okay, what is a smaller lot in the context of Evans, particularly with what's being developed currently or what's been developed in the past? What does a small lot mean? Is it, what is the size of that? What is the width of that? How much open space should we have on that? Again, trying to get to a pattern that is palatable for folks that want to buy this product or rent this product. And then moving all the way down to apartments on a small lot. What you're getting currently in terms of apartments are some of those medium and larger apartment projects. But we think there's probably an opportunity, again, from a price point and a variety point, that there's smaller apartments that could be accommodated in the community. And so, again, this is kind of what we're starting to work through in terms of what do those development standards become to help provide that variety and that range of opportunity for people at all segments of the housing market, from the upper end to the lower end and everything in between. And if you go to the next slide, well, I guess real quickly, if you go back one slide, is there any questions about this table? And again, as we start to put this together.
Does anybody have any questions? Okay, we'll wait till the end.
Okay. So if you go to the next slide, what we've been working on again recently, and what I'm trying to get to Ann here in the next couple of days, is what we call our regulatory framework. And so this is for the code as a whole, not just the housing component, but for the code as a whole. And what this does is really help us organize the code, make sure that everything is linked together, is related where it needs to be related. We are always focused on simplicity and making sure that it is easily understandable, because this is one of the most technical documents that you all use. Your planning commission uses, your staff uses, the people, your residents will use it at some point. So it needs to be really user friendly, but also it's a very technical document. So we're always erring on the side of simplicity and understanding. And then we want to build in all of those design details that can help project Evans as the community, as the master plan and the community has defined. So what is the scale, the format, the design details, uses that we can work with in the code, again, to project Evans forward and implement the vision for the future. And then flexibility. One of the things we talked about with the developers in particular was, we always hear from them, well, tell me what the rules are, but give me as much flexibility as possible. And so we think we have a pretty good way of doing that, either through design objectives, giving them alternatives, alternative ways to meet the standards, or is there a process that can go through that can provide them relief where they need it, and get something for the community as a whole. And then finally, the approval process itself, we're looking at kind of those logistical things in terms of where can we streamline the code and streamline efforts, what things need to be administrative or what things can be administratively approved versus a process, and then the PUD process. We really believe that the PUD process is kind of an option for very unique situations, but it also needs to have clear standards and a clear process for people to work through. And you can go to the next slide. So that's the next steps. Anne mentioned the tour on Friday. And as I said, we're drafting regulatory framework as well as some of these housing pieces that we're putting together, and that's what we'll be working on for the next few months. And that's all I had. So I'd take any questions.
So Ally, since you're online, do you have any questions or comments?
I do. Just really quickly, I guess for me, I mean, I do like all of this, and the simple fact that we're definitely trying to provide affordable housing for our community. But I guess one of the questions that I have is like, how do we keep people housed? Considering, right now, a lot of, community members are cost burdened. And so that is definitely a big concern for me. So, if we create something that's affordable, in essence, it's affordable as they initially enter into it, but then how do we keep them housed? So for me, I guess it's what other plans do we have in order to ensure that the rents don't rise at an astronomical level as they have been, and to continue to have these spaces continue to be affordable. With anything, I mean, anything can start at a very great price, but after a while, things tend to, or rents tend to increase. So for me, in order to continue to have affordability, I think one of the questions we need to answer is how do we keep people housed, and what do we have in place in an effort to ensure that that remains, whether it's a place having some sort of subsidy where they can assist people continue so it can continue being affordable. So I don't know if there's any kind of structure that we can provide in the event that the initial affordability doesn't become affordable in the future.
There's not much to do with that, especially with rents, because those are market driven unless it is a specified type of government housing. So I've never really seen a cap on the rents for a regular property.
And that's my point. Like, are we also considering that? Like, what is out there to provide assistance to people in an effort to keep it affordable?
I don't think that's something at city level. That's all I'm thinking.
Any other?
Did the gentleman leave?
No,
No.
he's still
No,
there.
I'm here. And that's really, I mean, like I was saying earlier, that's really to rent caps and things like that. That's really a policy discussion of the city council to make decisions of whether those things will be supported. The land use code itself is really the development standards by which things are developed in your community, the physical standards. But I do think there is something to maintaining affordability by providing that variety in your community. There's a great article, and I can pass it along to Ann if you all are interested. But there's a lot to be said for providing a variety to keep people who are in one economic strata from expanding into. It's hard to explain, but it's really getting people focused on the housing type and the housing price points that they can afford, because what a lot of communities will see, what they're seeing is that I may be able to afford a $500,000 house, but if this community where I want to live is offering $300,000, I'll just take that. Well, you're just taking something that's more affordable for somebody else. So providing that variety really starts to cut across all those different economics.
And I think for ownership, that's true. But I'm thinking about the rental component of it. If we were to, in essence, also consider that as well as, because you want diversity, right? And so it's just, as we speak of all, because we're going through the effort of doing all this, I think we should definitely consider even the policy component of it on how we ensure that things do remain affordable. That's all I have.
But okay, so I have three things I want to say real quick. Number one, for rentals, I think people forget it is a business. They have people that they have to pay. They have supplies they have to buy. There is a cost to landlords. Just because they have a rental doesn't mean automatically all that money goes in their pocket. And yes, there are bad ones, there are good ones, but that's something I think some people forget along the way, because they do have staff to pay. They do have to pay for advertising. They do have to pay to buy a new stove, new microwave. And I know that's something they should plan on, but we have to remember that when the rents change too. Second thing I want to say is it does feel like, or appear that we're being pushed towards smaller and smaller. And what we had actually requested was medium to large size, because we do have stuff in the works that is townhomes, multifamily, single family homes. We have quite a few of those things already in the work. So just looking at this, it really came across, and I'm not saying this is what's happening, but it felt like we were being pigeonholed to go smaller and smaller. And that's not fair to people that do have a more flexible income. We need to consider them as well. And then the last thing is, if we do go smaller, I don't see it helping the parking at all, because that's just going to get worse. Because I can tell you now, we've all talked about it, a lot of families are moving in with multiple generations with them, and they all have, like 5 million cars, because everybody's got to have a car, which I get. But if we go smaller, the parking is just going to get 100%, 120% worse. That's just a couple things I saw. I'll let you go.
Well, now that you mention it, I totally agree. I mean, we sat around here and we've discussed that we want to make sure that we have a place for someone to move up to, and then they're going to leave their affordable home open for somebody to purchase. We have RV park going in. We've got plenty of affordable trailer parks to live in. We've got several projects going right now. I think what we need to be we need to be understood here. It seems like we mentioned this and then it's just glazed over. And in the past, when this has been done, it's because there's some project coming down the pike that somebody wants to push through. And for example, the little tiny homes that are supposed to be built, 14 of them on little 50-foot lots. So I think that that's not where we want to go. There's plenty of affordable living available here. You build what you want to attract. And when people like Councilmember Amanda here, when she has enough money saved up, she looks at Evans, no place for her to move, she's going to move to Greeley, or she's going to move to Windsor or somewhere else. So I think that needs to be heard, is that we are looking for a middle and a higher place to go. Not very many openings are in Devil's Crossing right now. One you looked, okay.
One.
But anyways, so that's what we need. And I think also, so I'm pretty sure I have the rest of council on this. With the ADUs, we can just can that right away. We don't want to consider ADUs. If you guys want to know what ADUs are going to look like, I can point out every single RV that has an occupant in, and I don't care how they argue that there's no occupants in there. I can point them out and tell you that there is. So it's a mess. You have 10 cars, you have 20 dogs, and it's just, it's horrible. If we want to make Evans better, we have to have better homes.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think part of my problem, so a couple of things. First, when we look at the multi-unit types within a neighborhood, I'm actually in favor of that. But I think we already have that. When I look in Tuscany, where I live, we've got a multitude of apartments. We've got townhomes and duplexes and all of that within the area that is Tuscany. What kills me, though, is none of that is affordable. And that's the part that I keep cringing at. And I get what Councilwoman Johnson was saying in regards to affordability, because that's part of my struggle. We can't control that. We can put in apartments all day, but I guarantee you the people in those apartments are all paying more than I pay for my mortgage. And that's the part that's really hard for me. And yes, my husband and I have lived in our home for 10 years. the reason we don't move right now is because we are wanting to stay in Evans and there is not a market for us to move up. When you consider prior council members who moved, they wanted to stay in Evans, they had to move to Greeley. And it's not that, it's just, to me, that's devastating to see such awesome, community members who do give a lot to the city have to move. So that piece is troublesome. My other question, when we're considering affordability, and I keep, if we look at 80 to 100% of area median income, it's my understanding that our area median income is around 65,000. So are you saying that we need to have homes priced around 65,000? Okay, because I was like, that's never gonna happen.
That
I
area
mean, here's a
median
shoebox.
income
Like,
is the income that people make so that they can, it's the price point that they can afford. So 80% of that AMI, what somebody making 80% of AMI, what they can afford, to somebody making 120% AMI, what they can afford. That's kind of that middle. And just to be very clear, Evans doesn't have a housing authority. We're not looking to form a housing authority. We're looking at really targeting that middle, making sure that people that need rental workforce housing have flexibility in the code, and that's missing. We're looking at targeting that middle and what in our region we can absorb, but we're not forgetting the estate. We're not forgetting ag. We're not forgetting the R1. We're keeping those, but we're focusing on some of that middle, because that's where we're missing.
yeah,
That's what's kind of broken in our code. The others we have.
and I get that. I think, sorry, my struggle there though is I struggle to see how we control that, because we can put in multifamily, we can put in all of this, but I'm really struggling to see an affordable house. Even a tiny home at this point in time is pretty darn expensive. Even if it's on a postage stamp size lot, I think we're fighting against an economy that isn't even kind of in our favor. My husband and I, like I said, we bought our house 9 years ago, to be exact, 9.5. And our house has gone up in value more than 100% since we moved in. Seems great for us, but the problem is if I sell my house, I'm going to buy the exact same house for twice as much. And so I look at it and go, great, let me sell this asset and then, struggle to find a home for less than $500,000 for a family of 4. That's crazy to me. And I think that's where I just struggle with it. So I think, in looking at the mix, I think that's great. But to me, part of that mix, and the biggest part of that mix, really needs to be, what is that next step for individuals and how do we accomplish that so that we can, to your point, my husband and I could move to a different neighborhood in Evans and then our home does open up for somebody else. But right now you probably have a lot of families like me that, could we move at some point? Would we like to move at some point? Yeah, but I'm not risking it right now. And if I moved, it'd have to be outside of the city.
So can I mention something really quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
And I think that was my issue. I know we're thinking about affordable housing, and right now, since I think Ann mentioned we're at 65 AMI, that is like low, and usually right now, like it's hard to find housing under 60 AMI, and we're like right above it, and 65, that's very low, and so. My issue is, like, I know we're speaking of let's create affordable housing, but how do you sustain it? Because what happens is you create these homes, yet this person is not getting a raise high as quickly as how the market's increasing. And so my thing is, how do we sustain what we are trying to create and keep people housed? Because again, 65% AMI, that is, wow. I mean, they can't even afford currently the rents that are out there. So for me, it's like, how, we need to, I know we don't have a housing authority and we're not thinking of creating a housing authority. And not that I'm saying that we're doing this, but that's what it sounds like is needed because of the AMI that we're working with. And so my concern is we create something with good intention, yet later it doesn't work out the way we anticipated because we don't have things in place in order to ensure that the cost is there. So my thing is there's like subsidies where the government can help and provide assistance in order to, and granted, I know developers and builders may not get the amount of money that they will get in an effort to build specific areas, but it's really working together with builders as well as grants or like federal monies in order to ensure that we provide this type of housing for our community that is sustainable.
We have Councilmember Neal, and I think Councilmember Providence might have
I'm,
something to
I'm
add.
good. I'm good now.
Yeah, so we can wrap this up because we have a few other things on our agenda. So Councilmember Neal of Providence.
Very good. Well, it's hard to control myself with this. I think part of the thing that you have to look at is when this first started, I felt that we're looking at building some more slum housing, low-income housing for low-income people. And that's not what I thought we were supposed to be doing. And I think when you talk affordable housing, there's a mindset. I purchased my house in Evans, working for part-time for the college for $2 an hour. Going to college, I got into that, and I couldn't find a job in my field. So when Kenny Monfort reopened the packing plant, I got a job in the storeroom out there, making $5 an hour. And I went through a divorce with a lot of bills that I could not pay in full at the time. And I made it through all of that by just being frugal. I drove a 75 Datsun B210 for 22 years, and everybody laughed at me. But that's part of the mindset you have to do if you want to get your house paid off and all your bills from a bad divorce with a drug addict wife. And you don't go out and buy a new car or a new SUV for $100,000 a year or the latest and greatest television, stereo, whatever. Back then, the most expensive dish network package, sports package, whatever. So I believe it's part of the it's part of the mindset from the people that are looking at buying a house. And I certainly agree with Councilwoman Morrison. We don't want these smaller lots. All you have to do is drive through Grapevine Hollow. And when I first got on council, we had a problem out there. And the former fire chief out there, and he was out there when we were discussing it, he said, this, in his opinion, that subdivision should have never been built with those narrow streets out there like that. And when you start cramming things so you can let the developer build more houses so he makes more money, then it just creates more problem with parking. And with the ability of our emergency services vehicles to get through that development.
Councilmember Providence.
I moved to Evans about close to 7 years ago. I'm surprised the value of my house pretty much doubled, and I'm very concerned about my neighbors and even my kids. The issue of housing, it's pretty much a national issue right now. I don't know where. I think it's something that our federal side should be probably look into more. But dealing with Evans, I would like to see Evans grow grow, but still remain affordable on whatever level we can. But as for having smaller housing, I see some other further issues going to develop from that. So what we currently have right now, a plan moving forward, I'm definitely on the board with that.
I'll just wrap this up real quick. So, one, I mean, I understand there needs to be a balance and diversity in the portfolio of housing. Two, what I don't want to see is we are infilling places with affordable housing. You know, I want to make sure that our portfolio remains diverse, and I also want to drive the median household income in Evans up. And that is also by diversifying the portfolio with those larger homes, those larger estates, and bring in those people of the higher income bracket into Evans, which will provide more services and, you know, drive more commercial activity. I don't want us to be, well, Evans is going to be, we're just going to start infilling with affordable housing. I don't want to see that happening. That's kind of what it sounds like. Well, when we have infill, this is what we're going to do. I don't want that. I don't want to see that. Again, I'm all for affordable housing, but not just picking and choosing and infilling where we have areas to do it. I want it to be very diverse and drive the median income up in the area. I want workforce housing, but I also don't want it to be what Evans is defined as. So that's just my thought on that. So that's, yeah, but I appreciate all of the work that you've put in for it and everything. So.
Very much so. All right.
Graham, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
If you all
Thank you.
If you all have other points, please get them to Randy or get them to me, and we can just continue the conversation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, can I make a suggestion based on time? There are a couple
Sure.
items that we really must get to tonight.
Okay.
That includes the utility rates and impact fees and the budget revision.
Okay.
If we could take those two, perhaps out of order, get to those, and then come back with the master plan invitation and the attorney chat.
Let's do the budget. Will that work first?
That's my suggestion,
Okay.
yeah, please.
That sounds
Jackie,
great. Thank you.
ready? Okay. All right, so we'll skip and we'll go to item number 4, 2022 budget revision number 2.
Should have done some of this last week.
Utility rates. We go to utility rates first, please.
Oh, utility rates? Okay.
Got a perfect presentation for our utility rates. So staff at this point is putting together our fee schedule for next year's fees that will begin on January 1st, but we did want to take the opportunity to spend a few more minutes on both utility rate recommendations, as well as impact fees and system development fees. And we'll just move through them. The first utility to discuss is our water utility rates. These rates that you'll see here have all been vetted through Water and Sewer Board with recommendation to bring them to you tonight to consider, or continue the process for them to be considered. Our base rates for water pay for our major maintenance and operation of the water system. We historically have increased those rates 75 cents per month per unit to help keep upkeep with inflating costs, continued maintenance programs, and having money for unforeseen maintenance issues that may arise. Looking at implementing those rates again for next year would bring the in-city base rates from $21.75 to $22.50 for in-city per month, and then for out-of-city customers, same 75 cents, bringing that up to $23.50. And then we know we have both that base water charge as well as that potable consumption charge. We've been told by Greeley to expect a 5.5% rate increase next year for our treated water. We have historically run those calculations. We did again this year to see if there's any way we have excess funding to help absorb some of that. Unfortunately, we don't. We're trying to continue the emphasis for water conservation efforts, all the great things that our water fund is doing. So staff does feel it's prudent to increase that same 5.5% onto our user rates as well. The chart at the bottom of this table does show those rates. It ends up being about a 30 cent per 1,000 gallon increase for those customers that are in that tier 1 water consumption rate. 2 additional rates in our water fund outside of treated water is our non-potable and our ditch rates. Historically, what we have done for these rates is inflate those by our consumer price index. So this year is 3.5%. That's the consistent rate we've used for our supplies and services costs throughout the city as well. And just wanting to point out that Justine is doing a ton of work on the ditch. It'll be extremely valuable as we undergo an entire water rate study for next year. We'll really look at all the various sources of our water enterprise, ensuring that the funding sources are sufficient to pay for each of these programs, that they're funded appropriately, we're planning for capital future needs, and that those rates are set. So I anticipate this time next year might be looking at different rate structure recommendations, some other items as well. But for this year, recommending that same inflationary rate increase. The good news is in wastewater for next year, we're not recommending a change to wastewater residential rates for next year. As you will recall, last year council adopted a wastewater rate plan, and it did forecast an annual inflationary cost increase each year. So looking at that, there was about a 3.5% to 4% annual increase there, which means we're covered for next year. That CPI cost doesn't look like it will exceed what's already built into the rate structure. What we should think about at this point, though, is that's probably not going to be the case next year. So I don't anticipate being before you next year saying the same thing. If inflation continues to outpace some of those initial assumptions in the rate study, then we likely will have to continue to add on additional inflationary costs into our wastewater rates. The rate study itself, though, did have a rate increase in the commercial rates, so about a 6.5%. And if you recall that some of those charts kind of showed a leveling, if you will, so that those commercial rates were paying a larger proportionate amount of their share of the impact on the wastewater fund. Okay, storm drainage. Bear with me, we'll talk in a little bit more detail on this fund than we maybe historically have. Over the last few council meetings, there's been lots of great discussion on the east side storm drainage projects, future planning for both 35th and 31st Street, those outfalls, and some of the really necessary improvements on the east side of the city for infrastructure on storm drainage. We're really looking at that and saying, what do we need to do today to start to plan to have the money to accomplish some larger projects in the future? So rather than place a smaller inflationary rate on the storm drainage rates for next year, what staff is recommending is looking at kind of a 5-year increase, implementing a 15% annual rate increase onto those storm drainage rates. And hopefully that will accomplish 2 major factors. One, it'll start to accumulate some available funding in the storm drainage fund itself, so that as unforeseen major maintenance and capital projects come up, there's some funding available to pay for those items. It will also essentially double the rates in that 5-year time frame that would set us up to be able to entertain another tranche of debt if we wanted to take on an additional $8.6 million like we did last time in SRF funding to accomplish that first round of projects. We know that both of those things need to be in place for us to look at another large underlying project or chunks of projects on the storm drainage. So in that model, what is in your staff report and not shown on this slide is an additional table of what those rates would look like. So for 2023, that 15% increase means $1.52 per single family home per month on your storm drainage rates. Over that 5 years, as I mentioned, it will effectively double those rates. So we're currently at $10.12. It would bring it to about $20.35. And if you recall, the reason we were at the $9.94, I believe, was to get us to that level to service the debt on that $8.6 million. So really, it sets council up for some freedom to make some future decisions, sets us in a good path to at least have some available funding if at any point in this 5 years, council decided, no, we change of direction, we want to back off on those rates, push out the priorities of doing those projects, we could easily back off, but it would still allow us at least to have some of that available funding in this storm drainage enterprise. That's kind of a different concept. We haven't had a chance to go over that until tonight. Are there questions on that specifically before I continue on some of the other fees?
I have one quick question. Would it be something we vote on every year?
Yes. So
Okay.
you'd be setting these rates too.
That's all
So,
I need.
yep,
Thanks.
all we're asking is for this 15% increase to be considered for 2023.
Thank you.
Good clarification.
And just kind of frame the policy question and policy decision for you. In our eyes, one approach certainly could be, let's not be so ambitious. Let's not think of doing another $8 million in projects in 5 years. If that's your approach, we don't need to raise fees this quickly. The other approach could be, let's go slower in the early years and then raise fees more dramatically in the later years. We've seen that. Some of you on council recall the near doubling of the wastewater rates back in 2015, 2016. That's very dramatic, perhaps traumatic impact on the community. So, but it is a viable option if you choose to pursue that. So what we're presenting here is a recommendation that takes a middle ground, says, yes, let's be prepared to do a large tranche of projects in the next 5 or 6 years, and let's do so in a way that doesn't present a dramatic upswing in the rate in 1 or 2 years.
But we've delayed that for 50 years now or more, so it's got to be done. It's the same way with the increases from the treated water. They're just going to keep going up 15 or 20%. And yet we keep hearing from staff that we can't run these non-potable lines to reduce that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of my thought too, is, I think if we delay it, we're only going to increase those even greater in the future. Costs are only going to increase, and as we have more wear and tear on that system, that's just gonna make it worse. I remembered reading an article, so I was looking it up, but, Greeley's is increasing 18% this year. So we're not outside of the norm. Theirs is actually $1.54 on average, so we're at $1.52. So I think we're seeing that across the industry really, but we continue to see costs associated with any kind of construction or maintenance or anything of these systems skyrocket. So I think that 15% is palatable, and I'd rather do 15% over 5 years than maybe a little bit less, and then in 3 years we're going, hey, we have to have a 40% increase or a 100% increase at that point in time. So I'm in favor of it.
Great, thank you for those comments on those pieces. Moving on to our trash and recycling rates. These are the rates indicative of the contract that council's approved with Waste Management that will begin on January 1st. However, you haven't had a chance to really give direction to proceed on these rates. But this is unchanged from some of those earlier staff reports that accompanied that contract with Waste Management. But as a reminder, what a current resident is paying for trash-only service is $14. We are recommending that that rate stay the same. So this will be the one unchanged rate. Waste Management, as a reminder, did offer us a price decrease to stay with them and renew that contract, which was so great. Will allow us to pay more for some of the cleanup weekends, offset some of the cost of printing and mailing bills and all those sorts of things. But we do want to keep that rate the same for residents. What it does is really incentivizes the trash and recycling bundling. So what Waste Management has said is that they would give us a break for those bundles as well. And so we're able to pass that on to our residents at a pretty hefty level. So what we're proposing is to take Waste Management's rates for all the other services. So bundling service, a second trash or a second recycling tote, and we're adding a 10% margin onto Waste Management's cost to us to help pay for those things I just mentioned, the bills, cleanup weekends, that sort of thing. So if you wanted a second trash cart, you're currently paying $6.90 for that. You will only pay $4.40 for that next year. You'll see an NA in that recycling only. That's not an option. Here in Evans, you have to have trash to have the recycling option. You can't just participate in our recycling program, but you can get a second recycling cart if you want. Huge savings on that. If you have a second recycling bin, there's really only a handful in the city that do. You're also paying over $10 for that cart, you'll now pay $4.40 for that as well. But this last line is the really exciting one. If you currently have trash and recycling both, you're paying $24.78. And next year's rate structure here, you'll pay $18.70. So you'll save over $6 a month to have that bundle service. So we've begun the communications with Waste Management to use a lot of their materials. Lance is in the loop with us on how we can really leverage the information they have to put out to residents to show them the benefit, really encourage that dual participation. We don't have to have a certain level of that dual participation for Waste Management to give us this pricing. Although we did kind of do a Scouts honor that we would do our best to encourage it. It's good for residents, it's good for our city, it's good for our environment. So we'll continue to push that and allows the residents to save while we take advantage of Waste Management's very gracious new contract with us too. So it feels like a win-win overall.
May I ask a quick question relative to that, or make a statement, I'll say? So speaking from my personal experience, my husband and I have 2 polycarts. That's our current structure. With the amount of Amazon I order, it could probably be a polycart and recycling. But I'm not gonna lie, I'm not savvy enough to know what I should and shouldn't recycle, and I'm always stressed, like, what if it's really trash and I put it in recycling, or what if it's, because I know that's an issue. If there would be some way to educate the public on the ease of recycling, I think people like me, I'll speak totally from personal experience, it may be advantageous because we could look at it and probably switch if I just knew how simple it was. But I'll be honest, I don't know how simple it is, and I don't ever think about it, right? I never sit there and go, I should probably look that up until moments like this. So if we could put that out there, I do think it would be advantageous, particularly in a world where so much is just delivered in a box to our front door. That may be advantageous to help educate and encourage people to do that bundle. Absolutely.
It's a great idea. And the new bins, new recycling bins do have, because those lids are so large, they have a very large graphic on it that says, has 2 columns, what you can recycle, and then the circle with the slash through it, do not recycle styrofoam and
It's in the brochures too.
other types of cardboard that can't be recycled. So.
And there also, as a reminder, appreciate those comments. Waste Management is working on a website that will interface with ours so that residents could easily have access to look up, how do I schedule a large item pickup? What does that cost? So it is designed to be some FAQs there, some ease of access. We'll also take some heat off of our customer service friends up front that are answering questions like that too. So that's great. And then they're really redoing a lot of their materials and information that we really haven't known were there and available. And so it's been really great to see Waste Management's push for some of that communication in the residents. I think we've been working with Lance too to see how we can get those out and what else we can do with them in the Evans Express and lots of different things. So hopefully you see lots of new reminders and push for that next year.
Sorry. And along the lines of education, I think that extra polycart at only $5 needs to be, put out there too. I think that would help with a lot of people that can't seem to get their trash in there, and I think they think it's very expensive to have a second cart. So if we can have some publicity on that, that would be fantastic too.
Yeah, I know. I get questions about it constantly from our neighbors on, oh, it must be expensive. I'm like, no, it's actually really cheap. And I'm paying the $6 right now, and I still think it's worth it. But we don't even use it every month. But let me tell you, this season, when it's Christmas season, it's so nice to have that additional polycart and not have to play trash can Jenga. So I appreciate it.
It keeps the city clean.
Yes.
And it's great that we finally got an aggressive competitor to challenge Waste Management.
Yeah, it's a good bit.
The pricing certainly reflects that, I think.
That's great.
Great. Well, just a couple other items here. Keep an eye on our time. We do have system development fees for water, wastewater, and storm, recommending the same inflationary factor for all of those. As a reminder, this is development costs. These are the fees associated with new development, new building coming into the city. rather than a 3.5% inflationary factor, we've applied a 7.4% factor on those rates, and that's our ENR Engineering News Record standard. As a reminder, those indices trend closer to true construction costs rather than disposable income and consumer spending. So for water, wastewater, and storm, again, all similar factors on those. I'll kind of just blaze through this. I know we're at a shortage of time. But before I end, the one thing not shown on this slide are the impact fees as well. They're in your staff report, and two different factors on top of those rates. So our code actually has two different standards for how we apply inflationary increases to those. Our transportation and our park facility impact fees are CPI inflated, so 3.5% on those fees. All others, fire, police, and fire and police are based on that ENR 7.4%, as you just saw on the utility funds. No impact for the school impact fees. Those are designated by the school district and passed along to us rather than us initiating rate increases on those. But for all of these, again, these will be in our fee schedule to begin on January 1. With direction from council tonight to proceed with these, we'll begin to start to queue these items up for our development and building community as well. And then all of these revenues have been built into the 2023 budget this way as well. So I'd be happy to answer any other questions you might have.
Councilmember Johnson, do you have any questions or comments?
No, I do not. Thank you.
Anybody else?
No, looks great. Thank you.
So council, the next time you see these will be part of the 2023 fee schedule adoption. We'll bring this together with all the other fees. Let's see.
All right, we'll move on to the budget revision, number 2.
Okay. And there's no presentation for this one, which is shocking, right? This is a very short item. Everything is in your packet tonight, but we are really only asking for approval to proceed with 4 budget revision items. I think I've never said that. Probably never gonna happen again. Yeah.
Real?
So we have kind of 2 different factors. We were able to accomplish that short list due in part with salary savings that the city has seen organization-wide. So we'll talk about the 4 items really quickly, and then we'll talk about that salary savings impact. But the 4 items are only one from the general fund. Council gave direction on October 18th to proceed with speed display signs and radar messaging sign. We do have sufficient money in our traffic calming restricted revenues. It's part of our general fund balance held for these very specific types of purposes. So those are not appropriated. We'll ask that be included in the budget. So about $45,000 will accomplish all of those things that you heard Mr. Reamer speak to. Our police impact fund is requesting about $73,000 to increase our police fleet by 1 marked vehicle. I thought maybe they'd be cheering. Okay, fine. So the other 3 you'll see from salary savings in the general fund. With this 4th one, it's appropriate for us to use that impact fund for an increasing fleet for this purpose. So just 1 item there. Our refuse fund, we've seen over the past couple of years, as we're growing and those accounts are growing larger than our budgeting forecast for those are, we need to add an additional about $25,000 both on revenue and expense, so a 0 net impact to that fund, just to make sure we stay within our statutory budget limit there in that fund for this year. And then lastly, in our CIP Streets Fund, we have an increase of $600,000 that reflects a construction contract awarded on June 20th for 23rd Avenue widening construction. So just truing that up in our budget. Pretty straightforward on those items. You do have the funds, long-range plans for each of those affected funds in your packet as well. We do have sufficient revenues to cover each of those items. And then going back to the salary savings, there is a laundry list of items in your staff report totaling about $651,000 that we've heard from council, received some preliminary direction to proceed with. We do anticipate having about $900,000 of this year, which is amazing. We did also see in our budgeting process this year, as we really fine-tuned all of our 2023 projections and had a larger health insurance increase, that we were overestimating some of the insurance increases that attributed to this 900,000 a little bit as well. So yes, there were difficulties hiring. We had positions that were approved at the beginning of the year that may not have been filled until recently. Adding to our salary savings, we also had a fair amount of benefit savings as well compared to budget. So all of those things are good things to have at a time like this when we're looking at other things we need to spend. Although I also don't anticipate being able to be here this time next year saying that also. So just to kind of run through them real quick so that you know what those items are. Again, we'll pay for the one new police car out of our police impact fund, but about $201,000 represents the other 3 vehicles. So for a total of 4 that we'll be purchasing there. We do have our one-time bonuses that council approved to bridge that gap of the market adjustments that weren't funded in next year's budget. Those are actually being paid out this week to staff. And so that money will be paid for with existing salary savings as well. We have $100,000 in this list for a recreation business plan. So as we look to the community to hear what is it that Evans wants as far as recreation facility and programming needs, that project will probably be somewhere in the $80,000 to $100,000 range. So we'll begin that right away. Police department needs happen all throughout the year. We do kind of keep an eye on it because they ebb and flow with their staffing more than anybody else. Sorry, I'm trying not to look. You know, as sergeants and lieutenants have development programs, given direction for surveillance cameras in the parks, additional signage for 4th of July, all those types of things through the year that are come up as new needs are able to be paid for with the salary savings, which is great. Recruiting costs for the city manager position, as you all are aware of, also coming from salary savings. Outfield reseeding at Riverside Park was a necessary item we needed to act on pretty swiftly this fall. Great to have the money to move with that. Franchise fee legal agreements that we're getting close to working or to wrapping up. That legal cost also additional above our budget. And then we've been working with the fire district as well to remove that existing traffic mast arm out front of their station on 37th that isn't functional right now. Looking at removing that, putting up signage, and how we can maybe partner with them to get some new functioning signage working after an accident happened and left that not as functional as it was. We'd like to be able to work with them pretty quickly and get that issue taken care of. Anything else on that item? No? Okay. So yeah, that rounds up the other 3 items. With council's direction tonight, then we'll queue up an ordinance for your next meeting and public hearing to get these items formally built into this year's budget. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Councilmember Johnson, do you have any questions, comments?
I do not. Thank you.
Anybody else? I do want to make one quick comment. I know this will be for a future discussion, but I know when we talk about police vehicles, getting that one that for the 73 and then the other 3 coming along, maybe we can have a discussion later on about what it would cost and what it would look like to be able to provide each officer, and I'm going to say the senior officers, with their own police vehicle that they can take home. I would like to see what that would look like. Maybe something to discuss for next year. That way that we can also help, with recruitment and retention of the police department. If we could provide the officers with their own vehicles that have been here for a certain number of years or longer. So.
Put it on the list, so thank you, Jim.
Other than that,
And this does, as we talked about during the budget process, this does queue up an opportunity probably late in the first quarter of next year for you to take a good look at the general fund surplus, the excess revenues over reserves.
Yep.
We haven't touched those, obviously, any of this because of that problem or blessing, whatever you want to call it, of having the salary savings. So by be able to tap that to the tune of that $650,000, very modest impact on the general fund balance. So you will be carrying a significant fund balance forward. The many ideas on that list. I won't go over them tonight, but there were other additional road maintenance issues, perhaps some paving of some portion of the streets that aren't paved on the east side, that kind of thing, that all of you please do be thinking about. We'll queue up that discussion for, say, the end of March, early April next year.
I do really quickly, I apologize, want to say, that $900,000 salary savings is no small potato, and I'm sure I speak for most when I say thank you to every individual who was impacted by one of the salaries that was included in that, because I think that's a significant impact on our city when you consider how many individuals account for that $900,000, and those were not, people coming in at a lesser price or those sorts of things. Yes, there may have been some insurance, but it's really positions that were unfilled, and that's big and speaks volumes to the amount of work that the staff had to pick up. So just thank you to everybody in regards to that, because that is not a small lift, and it's known and appreciated.
Well, thank you for any of the citizens that were impacted by maybe not getting a quick response or
Yep.
seeing the other side of that shortage of staffing. So
agree.
hopefully they will be able to see a better, both the staff and the citizens will see some more action with maybe those positions being filled.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll go back to the master plan.
Yes, please.
All right. Now we'll go back to the item number 2, master plan implementation with progress dashboard.
Yes, Council, as they're getting set up for that, this is a follow-up to the community master plan that you adopted earlier this year. As part of that, there's a commitment on staff's part to be transparent with the progress on those action items coming forward. Some of those are qualitative action items, and you'll see some examples of those. And many of those are quantitative. They're things that we can measure, objective measures. And this dashboard that staff will present here in just a moment is an effort to be transparent, to show progress or perhaps lack thereof, where there are obstacles or challenges looking forward over the next several years, and how the master plan implementation is going. So turn this over to Ann Bess Johnson, and a face that you don't get to often see, but is an incredibly valuable staff member. Anna Jareb is our GIS analyst, working in the IT department, and is very skilled on what you're about to see. So.
Yep, so this project has been under development since early or late 2019, where we've been talking about updating our master plan and how do we communicate our accountability for the action items that are in the master plan. Many communities will adopt a new master plan, sits on a shelf, you have to update it every 5, every 10 years, but the city took a lot of time, took a lot of your time, took a lot of planning commission's time, and we want to show how we're accountable to our taxpayers that helped us update our master plan. So there are, again, this is something brand new for the city of Evans. We've never done it before, and so things that are new take time to get it right. This is our method of transparent communication. It's our method of transparent communication to you all and to our Evans coworkers on how we're implementing the plan. And we're going to start small, but we're going to keep building. So what you see tonight is our start, and that's what's being unveiled. And the intent is to go live in January with what we have and just keep building. So what we're looking for you tonight in this work session is just thumbs up, thumbs down, things that you'd like to see. Are you pleased with what's being presented? And so I'm going to turn it over to the mastermind of what is being presented this evening. So to Anna.
So it'll start with a website that I've built out, and everything will be housed here. That's everything master plan. So this just explains what the master plan is and how we came up with the dashboards. And then our first dashboard is our demographic profile. This data all comes from the census, and this was data that we used throughout the master plan. And then this really goes into depth. If you click something like the population, it gives you where we've been the last 10 years, and then also even the projected for the next 5. So that is just the overview dashboard, and then we really get into each section of the master plan. These are the first 3 we've done. The first one is trails. So this really gives you a snapshot of what we are proposing, what we've already completed, and you can see in this map the different trails and where we have. And then this yellow one is showing what's currently in progress. This will be for water conservation, and it's not really used to this screen, so there's a little missing here. But this is also this is what we came up with of what's really important for residents to know.
And those measurables, because a lot of what's in the master plan is qualitative, and you can't measure that. So we're also looking at doing a community report card once a year that shows here are the qualitative items that we've been able to accomplish, and then this can be more of the quantitative items that we've been able to accomplish.
And then the last one we have is economic development. And this graph really shows the different industries we have in Evans. This one we found was really important because we have so many home-based businesses.
And we can utilize this when we have new developers coming into Evans to show them, you know, who is in Evans, how we've grown in the past. It can be used as an economic development tool to communicate the population that we have, where we're wanting to go, the type of businesses that we already have in Evans, and what has been successful in the past, plus where we want to go in the future as well. All right? Are there any questions? Comments?
Is this, did you say, I may have missed this, did you say that this is already on the city's website?
No, you're the first to see this. And so we're just seeking your input with, you like where we're going, you don't like where we're going, what would you like to see changed? And then this will probably go live in January. And we're just starting with the few that we have now, and then we'll keep adding to it as time goes by.
So highlight, what are some of the new additions that will be added?
Some of the new additions will be, we can focus on housing, we can focus on commercial development, industrial development, natural resources. All of the different themes of the master plan will be represented in its own individual tile that you'll be able to take a look at.
The next one is roads. It's almost done, and that'll show like the different projects we've accomplished and what's coming up.
That'll be a good one.
The only thing I have is the storefront, the way we have it labeled storefront businesses. Is there anything we could label it besides store? Because that automatically, makes someone think an actual Dollar General, things like that. Whereas that could also be like you guys have the mining, the industrial, if we have any agriculture businesses, things like that.
Physical business versus home-based
That's
business.
Or like brick and
something like
mortar.
that, because then we wouldn't confuse, because I'm sorry, that was where my mind jumped, and I'm not saying everybody will do that, it's just my mind goes, we don't have that many stores here, but.
I think that's actually
Sorry.
something we've changed a few times, trying to figure out what was best. So
Okay, sorry.
no,
Yeah,
you're
that's
right.
It looks good otherwise, I'm
Thank you.
just saying.
I think it's great. Yeah, I look forward to going in and kind of teetering with it and tinkering with it once it's up and running. I think from there, I may have more questions or thoughts, but I think having a dashboard, particularly on items from a community standpoint, that we can point residents to and say, hey, that's a great question. Have you seen this dashboard? And you can go on and look at the roads being a really big one, that they can see all of that. I love the trails with the map, and you can really hone in on that, and really like how you can kind of drill down into that information. I think that's fantastic.
Well, and on this map, with the trails, you can start to see how the community is going to be linked together. And you can then go to this page and you can say, oh, I can get on the trail here, and here's a destination that I can get to. So this you can physically see it on the map, but you can also physically enjoy it in person.
Councilmember Providence?
Yes. What I personally would like to see, like we have a real-time feed, like a cam, like a update to viewing for somebody from the outside. They can able to log on to the site and just see panoramic view of what we can, the amenities of Evans, and still have a live feed. And also, if we can link to the National Weather Service, things like that, I think that'll be applicable. But once we get there, as it develops, we can have council discussion or whatever, more we can add to it. That's something I personally like to see.
Thank you.
Councilmember Johnson?
I agree with what has been mentioned and what has been brought up. Thank you.
I like the concept, I like where it's going. I'm glad that it's gonna be a living document that we can update as needed and as we have more information to put out there, and I'm glad it's being transparent as well, so I think it's going in the right direction, so great job on that.
Good job.
I think one thing I just thought of is it might be advantageous to have a submit a question form or something, so that if somebody's on here and they're wondering, hey, I noticed that I asked Randy a question today about some of the work along 47th. I noticed this. Can you provide me with an update as to A, B, or C? And then maybe we can mitigate some of those responses relative to these very specific items. I think that might be beneficial for that piece. And then if we're seeing the same thing, maybe it's an indicator of, oh, that's probably a good blip to put on here then. So just a thought. Really great.
And we just talked about the tools, so we
Okay,
have
there-
the tool.
There we go.
There you go.
Perfect.
Thank you,
All right, great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, it's time for attorney chat. Mr. Crowe.
Welcome back.
Schedule, okay.
Right, I know. I'm surprised.
So this is I feel like we're doing sort of a three-course dinner. We did the appetizer last time and talked about some of the acts, and I think we'll get through the main course tonight, and then there may be a few dessert items that we'll have to
I mean, if you want to bring ice cream to that one at the Alamo, that'd be great. I'm just saying, just throwing that out there.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking crumble cookies.
Cookies are always good.
And I don't have things like the police department where they get to play with their little inhalers and all those, so I thought food's the next best option. So last time the outlines I think were in your packet, and last time we talked a lot about housing and homelessness and things like that, and got through, I think it was, these are all numbered for ease of reference in case you have questions and want to go back to them. And I think we got through 108. So 109 is the Air Quality Improvement Investments Bill. And I'm not going to go through nearly all of these, as I mentioned before, but I'm going to try and hit the highlights in the short time we have on things that may impact Evans. This bill essentially creates programs available to municipalities, among others, to reduce air pollution. And the two main programs have to do with encouraging the use of electric bikes and electrifying buses, especially school buses. 110 is the broadband provider's use of public right-of-way, and you've already seen the effect of this bill. This is the bill that says cities can't require franchises for broadband providers. All you can do is regulate your right-of-way in the same way you regulate it for all public utilities, and you've adopted that right-of-way legislation earlier this, probably just the last couple of months, I think, is when we finished it. Number 112 is the building greenhouse gas emissions, and this relates to an item that's on your agenda tonight. Essentially, it says that when you update your uniform building codes, you also have to adopt a uniform energy conservation code. And the longer you put off adopting the code, the more restrictive code you have to adopt. So we're trying to adopt it sooner, so it's less restrictive, gives more flexibility to builders. And you will see that International Energy Conservation Code ordinance tonight during the meeting. Number 113 is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act Cash Fund. Essentially, this is the state's response to the big funding that the federal government did to pay for infrastructure. And a lot of those federal programs require local matches. So the state passed this bill to provide some of the funding for those local matches. And this is to do capital improvement projects, things like water projects, just almost every kind of capital improvement. Water, environmental, transportation, infrastructure, broadband, power grid, and then what they call resiliency projects. And a resiliency project is anything that takes some of your infrastructure and makes it more resistant to either severe adverse weather conditions or natural disasters. So those are all funding that the state's going to provide the match for the federal funding. Number 114 is some changes. It's called the Privacy Protections for Protected Persons Act. Sounds a little redundant, but the legislature often is. And essentially, under CORA, the Open Records Act, there are some people whose information they don't put on the internet. And this adds to the list of those protected persons, people like code enforcement officers, healthcare workers, among others. So it just provides them some protection that applies not only to those people, but to their families as well. So if we get a CORA request for that information, then we tell people, no, that's not available. The Juneteenth state holiday, you guys have adopted Juneteenth. It's on June 19th of each year. Specifically, it reflects June 19th of 1865, which was the date that freedom was proclaimed for slaves in Texas, although it is a much broader celebration of African-American culture. Bill 116 is a repeal of attorney's fees on motions to dismiss. The way that relates to municipalities is a lot of times when cities get sued, they are sued for claims that are barred by the Colorado Governmental Immunity Act. So what cities do in response is they file early on in the case what's called a Rule 12B motion. It's a motion to dismiss that just says, look, Judge, we don't need to go through discovery and a trial and all of that. This kind of claim is barred by the Governmental Immunity Act, so let's just dismiss it at the beginning. And this act doesn't affect the ability of municipalities to do that, but in the past, because it's such a clear, I don't want to call it bogus claim, but unsubstantiated claim, that courts have generally awarded attorney's fees to the city, saying, you know, you shouldn't have been drug in here when it's clear under the act this type of claim is not allowed. This act makes it more difficult for cities to recover those attorney's fees. If the complainant can say, well, I was trying to extend the current law or the current statute or the current case law, then they can avoid award of attorney's fees. So it just makes it a little harder for us to get them in those circumstances. Number 117 is HOAs cannot regulate public rights-of-way. And we haven't really had it an issue here yet, but I can see it coming. It prohibits homeowners associations from putting up their own signs regulating traffic or implementing their own rules governing the use of public rights-of-way within their developments. It just says that you guys have the control over those. So, oversight of chemicals, this is number 118. Oversight of chemicals used in oil and gas. This just says that oil and gas operations have to disclose to the State Oil and Gas Commission the list of the chemicals that they use in the wells, the amount used, the purposes that they're used for, and the operators not only to provide that to the state, but to any municipality that's within a half mile of the well. So even if it's not within Evans, we may get that information. Also goes to the fire and police departments, so they know what chemicals are being used out there. 119 has to do with orphan oil and gas wells. Increasingly, we're seeing wells drilled, and then when they're done, people just walk away from them. Called orphan wells, where you can't find the owner, or the owner isn't willing to do what needs to be done to sort of finish up with the well. This imposes a fee on oil and gas operators, and then that fee money goes to a fund that's used to either plug the orphaned wells or to remediate them, whatever needs to be done. The 121 is the Reproductive Health Equity Act. This was an act that was passed by the Colorado legislature in response to the United States Supreme Court ruling overruling the Roe versus Wade decision. It essentially preserves the individual's right to continue or terminate a pregnancy. The bill refers to that as a fundamental right. It also prohibits municipalities, among other entities, from interfering with or restricting access to contraceptives and family planning information. Number 124 is the regulation of kratom processors. And mostly it's just directing that there be a study of kratom. I thought that's great. What's kratom? So I looked it up. Kratom is a tropical tree native to Southeast Asia. Consumption of its leaves produces both stimulant effects in low doses and sedative effects in high doses, and can lead to psychotic symptoms and psychological and physiological dependence.
Sounds like a great
Right now, it's not regulated by the state. There are some municipalities that are regulating it. Monument and Parker ban it. In Castle Rock, you have to be at least 18 years old to obtain it. But this is mostly to do a study to provide some guidance to municipalities on how they want to regulate kratom, if they want to.
Scott, when you investigated that, is that something they use in Guam?
Is that what?
Is that something they use in Guam?
Could very well be. Yeah. It sounded a little bit like, well, what's the stuff they have in Fiji? It's, and you either drink it at low tide or high tide, and eventually it sort of suppresses your central nervous system. And it's kind of the same, I think, effect.
I thought it was what Superman couldn't touch, so, what do I know?
Right. Well, and on a related note, this 125 is a study of devices assessing motorist impairment. For years, we've had great ways to do roadside tests for DUIs. You can do the stand on one leg or touch your finger to your nose, say the alphabet backwards, which I could never do even completely. So, and the lateral gaze nystagmus test and the roadside breathalyzers. We don't really have something that's that convenient and effective to do roadsides for drug use, especially marijuana use. So the purpose of this act is to essentially try and develop something that can be used on a more immediate roadside basis to determine if somebody is under the effects of driving while under the effects of drugs rather than just under the effects of alcohol. And then the last one on your main outline is the Powerline Trails Act. And it authorizes transmission providers to enter into contracts with public and private entities to construct and maintain power line trails in an existing or future transmission corridor. There's been some reluctance in the past for power companies to do that because of liability issues. And this is kind of a joint effort of the Division of Parks and Wildlife and some of those power companies to allow the use of those power line areas for trails, but at the same time preserving some of the critical habitat that is contained within those areas. So that's the main list. And I don't know if we want to get into it. I'd probably suggest we save it for dessert, but what that consists of is, in addition to this outline, we did much shorter outlines for each of the departments. We did an outline for the police department on acts that affect their operations, one for municipal court, one for the city clerk, one for human resources, and one for economic development. And I don't want to go through all of those, but I think at our next meeting, maybe even as part of my attorney report, I want to take just about 5 minutes and hit the high points for each of those acts as well, because they do have things in them that may not affect you, but I think you should at least be aware of. So with that, you've got 5 minutes for your council concerns, and unless you want me to keep on with dessert, I'll save it for next meeting.
Thank you, Scott.
Questions, comments? Councilmember Johnson?
I have none. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Scott. All right, council discussion. We got a couple more minutes. Anybody have anything for the group discussion?
I have something to think about for the future.
What's that?
That new housing development going behind Walmart on 23rd. Are we gonna do anything with Greeley for traffic mitigation along there because that is another racetrack in our city. And when they get to that corner where it just does a 90-degree, that can get a little scary. So I was wondering are they gonna like build a light? Are we gonna put in a four-way stop there? Because Harbor Lane ends right there.
Yep.
But if that housing's going up into there, and they fly up Harbor Lane anyway right now, but maybe something to look into for the future with Greeley is, are we gonna do something for traffic there?
That will be a new three-way intersection there
Okay,
with two directions stop.
thank you.
Stop signs.
I'll just real quick, so yesterday I met with the new president and CEO of JBS and had a great discussion with them. And one of the things that I'll be getting with Randy on later on is they have some monies available they can help do some work in the community. And one of those things of like improving like playground equipment, donating money to help rec centers, do project improvements around the city. So one of the things I suggested was trying to look at getting some money for beautification along Highway 85.
Yes.
Possibly.
That was suggested before and they said no on
Yeah.
that.
We might have some opportunities. I don't know. I'm not going to say 100%, but there's possibility that for like playground equipment replacement, that we might be able to get them to donate some of that. Maybe some recreation center equipment replaced, donate from that. But there's some things that we'll be able to look at and see what we can maybe partner on with them to help us out in the community. That's one of the big things that they're focused on is right now is helping people within their communities that live and work in the area. So
That's great.
that's pretty good
That's very good.
opportunities possibly for us.
I suggested a stage.
Sure.
Be good.
That's all I have. Anybody else have anything else?
I have something.
Right.
I just, this past Saturday, the Hispanic Women of Weld County had their breakfast, their annual work breakfast, where they provide 12 scholarships to Latina women, whether it's traditional or non-traditional, or if they're attempting to go to acquire their master's or doctorate. And I want to mention thank you to Mayor Clark for attending. He was there. It was a great event. Lots of people were there, definitely in attendance. The commissioners and a lot of the elected officials in the area definitely were there to support. So I just wanted to bring that up and say thank you, Mayor Clark, for being there and providing your presence. And it was great to see you.
I appreciate the invite, and you did a great job on your speech that morning. So that was great.
Thank you.
All right, anybody else have anything else?
I noticed today that there seems to be a lack of signs on the east side of town announcing that you were entering Evans city limits on First Avenue and also on First Avenue and 37th Street. I don't